Former Prime Minister Liz Truss has made her first international speech today, calling for the West to take a robust stance, I tell you, on China. This is all about trying to protect Taiwan. The first question that I've got, Alex Deane, is why is Liz Truss, the person in Japan, giving this address?
Because there's a group called the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, which is a campaign group that aims to foster more discussion about how democratic countries should deal with the rise of China and how it should approach questions over whether China is a threat to the global West and a threat to democracies. And not that I'm involved in it, I assume that their latest event or conference or something is in Japan. So she's been invited to go and speak at it. But I mean, former prime ministers and moreover, given that she was in the job for rather longer, former foreign secretaries do pop up on the international stage quite often. And the difference, I think, between Liz Truss and some of her predecessors is the speed with which she's been willing to do it. Most people who leave office normally give it a period of silence before they start shouting the odds again. Indeed, I thought the most flattering thing about John Major was the quiet dignity that he had after leaving office. Then he just started commenting occasionally. In the end, he couldn't help himself and he was talking about everything. Liz Truss has gone almost straight to that by speaking in a high-profile event so quickly. But we shouldn't be surprised by this. And the other point I'd make is that one of the questions, the difficulties a Prime Minister tends to have is what to do about or with a former Prime Minister. And this Prime Minister's got more of those than usual.
Yeah, it's a very lucrative job as well, being a former Prime Minister of this country, so it seems. But what do you think to her point? Because among other things, what she was saying is we almost need to have this new alliance, like an economic NATO-type creation, if you like, against China. Would you agree with a concept like that?
I'm slightly wary of the whole approach, to be honest. Look, I mean, I have little love for the Chinese regime. I mean, it's clearly an authoritarian regime. I don't think I would particularly, as a political activist, like to live under it. But I'm equally a bit worried about the way the world seems to be kind of militarising at the moment, and the way that leaders who I think should, where possible, try to speak the language of peace and dialogue and engagement, seem, I think, all too often these days to bang the drum for war. And that concerns me. And it concerns me that it's almost as if we always need an enemy in the West. You know, it was the Soviet Union during the Cold War, then it was Islam, now it's Russia and China and whatever. And it's almost as if we kind of look for that enemy purposely because we feel that
peculiarly kind of self-loathing position to look at Russia invading Ukraine.
If you'd let me finish the point, then we might be able to have some dialogue ourselves rather than bellicosity, Alex.
Go on then, get on with it.
So the point that I'm making is we need to try to avoid another Cold War if we can. But I think at the moment that the kind of sabre rattling from certain people is not particularly helpful and not really in the country's interests ultimately.
It's a peculiar worldview and peculiarly self-lacerating to look at Russia invading Ukraine and China's attitude towards Taiwan and say, well, the West must want enemies all the time, it must be down to us. That's all I was going to say.
Well, I mean, in terms of Taiwan, I tend to think, actually, the whole debate about Taiwan is much more complex and nuanced than some people give it credit for. It's often cloaked in the language of good and evil. It's often cloaked in the language of angels and devils, and I don't think, actually, it is.
Well, do you think Taiwan's going to invade China?
I think with Taiwan, for example, there are only 13 nations that actually recognise Taiwan as a sovereign state, one of which is the Vatican City. Not even America recognises Taiwan as a sovereign state. So my point, Alex, is, and this speaks to what I was saying at the beginning, often these disputes are much more complex and nuanced than people give them credit for, and simply speaking the language of bellicosity and banging the drum for war is not always helpful.
You were interested in
and doesn't actually help to bring about.
I think my memory is just about long enough to remember the beginning of those paragraphs where you said civility was important. In Taiwan, they have a democracy where the government can lose an election, the opposition takes power, and then that party loses and they switch back again peaceably and without issue. They have transparent financial situations. They respect patents. They have the rule of law. They are
not calling for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Let me just be clear about that, in case that's what you were deducing from that.
It was pretty much needed, because when you were
I don't think it was, actually.
when you were saying it's much more nuanced than people say.
No.
Well, no, it's not. Taiwan's not going to invade China, are they?
No, come on.
The aggression is all one way.
Alex, don't be silly. Saying that a historical territorial dispute is nuanced does not mean you want a major power to invade that particular.
You think China's got a right to? You think China's got a right to claim that island?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there's a legitimate claim by China, but equally, I think there are legitimate arguments the other side. It's one of these. It's a bit like Catalonia. Actually, when you look at the two sides, both can lay legitimate claims to a particular place. The answer to it, I don't think, is war. The answer to it is not war. The answer is engagement and dialogue and some sort of negotiated outcome.
But it's China, isn't it, that are saying that they want this all back by, I think their deadline is 2050, and it's China that's saying, and we will use force if necessary.
Michelle, China is saying, well, Taiwan has always been part of China. Now, you can disagree with that view, but my point is it's not such a far-out view that it's not possible to articulate it in reasonable debate. By all means, disagree with it, but don't try to represent it as an outlandish view, because anyone who does probably doesn't grasp the historical aspects of it.
OK, Paul, grasp this, because it's very easy. Oh, it's all so complicated, we probably shouldn't bother about it.
No, we shouldn't bother. No, I didn't say
the aggression is coming from China and China alone. It's not the West being aggressive, it's not Taiwan being aggressive, it's China being aggressive. Given your dislike of bellicosity, newfound but very welcome, that's where your attention should be.
But then to Paul's point then, that not many places and people, etc., and regimes do recognise...
because the Chinese say you can't. The Chinese say there is only one China and you must recognise us and not them. Of course, at one point, that argument worked the other way around, and everyone recognised Taiwan, then the Republic of China, rather than the People's Republic.
So do you think we should be concerned about China?
Hugely.
And do what about it then?
Look, there are two kinds of businesses. There are those who've been there's those that know they've been hacked by Chinese sources, and there are those that don't know that they've been hacked by Chinese sources. Most major enterprises have some kind of leak or approach from China, whether it be about their patents or about their business secrets or something else. So point one on that is clamping down on it. Interestingly, I've seen claims about China respecting patent law a bit more nowadays, because they're in favour of the death penalty for those who get caught breaching things. Well, that's tremendous and civilised once again. So that's part one. Part two would be that Taiwan is a liberal democratic nation, and we should be thinking very, especially given the commitments that have been made to it by America and others, about what defending Taiwan may look like. In the end, the Taiwanese are not going to roll over.
What does defending Taiwan look like, Alex, in your world?
The Taiwanese are very likely to be able to resist some kind of incursion, but will need more military...
They're tiny compared to China.
You know what, Paul? It's much more nuanced and complicated than you might realise. First of all, it's quite difficult to mount an island invasion. Second of all, unless you want to bomb everything, and one of the things you want to do is to acquire a place peaceably, then you're not going to carpet bomb something.
Taiwan pales into insignificance in terms of military power compared to China. You must recognise that.
Well,
you must recognise.
That's fascinating. So the exercises.
It's a statement of fact, Alex.
So the exercises that the Taiwanese run every year and are internationally observed, you just think that's for the birds. It's good to know, because if someone tried to mount D-Day style landings on Taiwan as the Chinese war game out, they don't need to. That's amazing. This is real insights we're getting. It's very helpful.
I just think it's fanciful to suggest that a relatively small country like Taiwan would be able to resist an incursion.
And that's just what they said about Ukraine against Russia.
I hope that it doesn't happen, and I would condemn China if they were to do it. However, we need to keep a sense of realism in the debate.
And some would say as well about, you say, yes, Ukraine is very small, and people have said exactly the same thing about Ukraine not being able to defend themselves, but actually it's not necessarily Ukraine defending themselves, it's Ukraine and half of the world.
Do you think the US the US and the West should send military support if in the event?
You love asking questions as if they're prerogative. We've already made these commitments.
It's a debate,
Paul.
Alex. You get questions. They might make you uncomfortable, but you're going to have to live with getting questions to elicit what your position is.
Do you think we don't? Do you think we should let them suffer and die? It's just a rhetorical question.
Maybe answer my question first. Do you think the West should put boots on the ground?
I said yes already.
I didn't hear you. That's interesting. So essentially a third world war then?
Oof. If that's not a note,
that's the reality. That's the reality. We need to be a bit more level-headed.
Do you think we're teetering our way into a third world war? That was the point we've just been ending that conversation on. Where do you stand on it? Give me your thoughts. GBViews@gbnews.uk.